We had a marvelous celebration, plural celebrations of Veterans Day these last few days. Some of you, I hope, were at Cary Hall on Saturday. The highlight of the celebration was to hear 4 Lexington High School junior students read essays. The topic of the essay was to write about a veteran in their lives who had influenced them. And when we started this project, we would have been grateful, truly, if we'd received like 2 or 3 essays, you know. We got 15. We were stunned and thrilled that 15 students took the time to write 15 really good essays. And we selected 4, and they were quite wonderful. It was a lovely ceremony. Earlier in the week, 4 veterans, one of whom is here. I'm going to ask him to just tell you a little about it. 4 veterans went over to Lexington High School and met with a very large number of high school students and just talked about their military experience and answered questions. And it was an amazing experience, and we were thrilled to find that the students were responsive and enthusiastic and interested and respectful. So I'm just going to ask Jim Ramsey, who was a member of the panel. Jim is a Vietnam vet, U.S. Navy, CB, and he'll just kind of tell you how it went from the point of view of a panelist.
Thank you, Linda. Well, from the point of view of a panelist, it was just fantastic. I guess I don't really have to probably say much more than 150 high school students, 5 to 10% of the population of the high school, chose to take time out of their busy day. This was a voluntary deal, so it was very well attended. All the things that Linda said were true. I guess I'd say what really struck me was, the questions were great. The students all filed out, and they filed past us. They took the time to shake our hands, they thanked us, and they had some interesting follow-up questions to ask. A couple who I spoke with, interestingly, were making some kind of plans for the military themselves. One of them was a member of a junior ROTC program in Boston, and another one was, actually she'd asked us earlier whether any of us had considered a service academy for college. None of us had. I asked her whether she was thinking about that. She said she had, but had decided that what she was going to do was go to ROTC at college someplace. But I guess the idea of service is alive and well in Lexington. I was impressed. So thanks for the chance to tell you about it.
Thanks. So altogether, it was really just a very rewarding week. Does anybody have any kind of an announcement that they would like to share with this group now? We're happy to entertain you.
Linda, will those essays be available for those of us who might be interested in seeing them?
Dan asks, would those essays be available? We can make them available because we did collect them. We did publish a booklet of them, which we distributed at the ceremony. We only printed a limited number because of our budget, but we do have them electronically. So yes, we can figure out a way to make them available. Happy to.
You could put them on the website, possibly.
Yes, exactly. Why don't we, Lorraine is here. Lorraine is Lorraine Marquis. Where are you, Lorraine?
She's maybe out
Still out at the table.
Oh, she's still at the greeter table. She's the chair of the Town Celebrations Committee. We'll figure out a way to get them on our website. I think you'd truly enjoy reading them. Thank you, Dan. That's a very good suggestion. All right, then, oh, excuse me, Bill, yes?
This announcement is unexpected. 40 and 50 years ago, way back when we could still hike, Walter Carter and I and our families loved to hike in the White Mountains with the Appalachian Mountain Club. And Walter brought his trombone along. He used to wake up everybody in the morning before breakfast by cranking a foghorn. But one morning, I heard Reveille being played on a brass instrument. And it got louder and louder and louder, and finally coming by our cabin was Walter playing Reveille on his trombone at 6 in the morning. Thank you, Walter.
Now you know something about our guest speaker. Let me now have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Walter Carter. Walter was orphaned as a young boy. His father, Norval Carter, a small-town doctor, was killed by a sniper while tending to a wounded soldier 12 days after landing on Omaha Beach on D-Day. Walter really didn't have a chance to know his father. It was years later, after his mother's death, when he read his father's letters, that Walter really got to know his father. He was so affected by these letters that he went on to write a memoir about his father. He joined the 29th Division Association, his dad's unit, and he worked with veterans to help them secure their rightful benefits. He became part of the American World War II Orphans Network. He became a board member of Normandy Allies, which escorts high school and college students to the Normandy beaches. Walter spent years thinking, writing, and speaking about the meaning and the changing views of World War II. As a young person, he held a simplistic view of the war, as I'm sure most of us did. It was a good war. The Americans were the good guys. They stopped some nasty, aggressive people, and they set the world right. But he has since come to realize that the war was much more complicated and much more nuanced. Walter holds a bachelor's degree from Swarthmore College, a master's degree from Tufts University, and a master's degree from the University of Rochester. Until his retirement in 1999, he was economist, vice president, and then principal with a unit of the McGraw-Hill Company. And here comes the trombone part. He is former president of the Newton Symphony Orchestra, and he is an accomplished amateur trombonist. Please welcome Walter Carter.
Thank you. It's true that I play the trombone, but you don't have to worry about that. It said that the definition of a gentleman is somebody who knows how to play the trombone but doesn't. And Bill, your word of thanks was appreciated because not everybody who heard me at 6 o'clock in the morning said thank you. After my mother's death in 1995, I found among her papers a collection of letters between her and my father that dated back to the 1920s when they were childhood sweethearts and lived across the street from one another in Huntington, West Virginia. Their correspondence ended in June 1944 when my father was killed in the Battle of Normandy. He had been a doctor who had volunteered to join the U.S. Army and had landed on Omaha Beach with the 29th Division on D-Day, June 6, 1944. He was serving as a battalion surgeon with the 29th Division and was killed by a German sniper while attending to a wounded soldier on the front lines on June 17th, the 12th day of the battle. These letters persuaded me to learn more about my father's life and the circumstances of his death, and then I went on a search for his story. I put what I found in a book, and that was published by the Smithsonian Press in 2004. I gave a talk about that book's story here at the Lexington Veterans Association in May 2006, after a very nice lunch with Bill Johansen. That book focused on my father's life and my mother's life and the impact that his death had on me and my family. But since the publication of the book, I've spent more time studying the war itself. I wanted to understand more about the event in which my father was willing to risk his life. And today I'd like to share with you some of the thoughts about the personal and historical meaning of World War II that I hold. I'll start with something simple and move on to something more complicated. And one place to start, simple place to start, is a dictionary. This is a dictionary I have at home on my desk, the American College Dictionary from 1958. And when I asked that dictionary what was World War II, it says, much more than a lot of dictionaries had it do, it was the worldwide conflict from 1939 to 1945, which rose from the undeclared wars of Japan and China in the early 30s, and the threats to peace by Italy and Germany in Ethiopia, Spain, and Central Europe in the years 1935 to 39. And it began with the German attack on Poland on September 1st, 1939, when France and Britain then declared war on Germany. The dictionary goes on to say, the early German triumphs in Europe encouraged Italian entry in June 1940, but the superiority of resources and industrial production, best visualized in air power and the atom bomb, especially after the entry of the Soviet Union and the US in 1941, enabled the United Nations to defeat Italy in September 1943, Germany in May 1945, and Japan in August 1945. Well, this dictionary definition of World War II is okay as far as it goes, but it doesn't really tell us much about what happened or about what people experienced. It doesn't have any emotional or judgmental content. I'd like to have an understanding or a statement or a definition that says something about my father and my country and my civilization and its history and its prospects. Did my father lose his life honorably in a good cause? Did my country use military force well and honorably in a good cause? How was my country affected? How was the world affected by this thing called World War II? And in order to lay the groundwork for considering what happened during the war, as well as how we might feel about it, form a judgment about it, I'm going to introduce a simple view that's subjective, inaccurate, and incomplete. And then we'll move on to some more realistic descriptions of what happened and see if we can come up with something better. When I was younger, much younger, a teenager, let's say, and age 10 and up, I had a fairly simple view of World War II. I got most of this view from the movies, the so-called comic books, playing with other kids, not from my mother, who was generally silent on the subject. I don't remember actually articulating this view, but if I had, it would have gone something like this. It has about a half a dozen components. World War II was a very big event, dominating the news, dominating people's minds, and it overshadowed almost all aspects of life at the time. It started, in my mind, with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. I didn't know about how that was connected with Germany or how Germany and Japan got together, but the news that hit us was Pearl Harbor. In my view, the Krauts, the Japs, the Dagos were the bad guys who started it all, particularly Hitler, Tojo, Mussolini. They wanted to take over and rule other countries or something like that. Americans were good guys who were unjustifiably attacked, and all the other nationalities were sort of helpless weaklings in need of liberation. There was also something about Germany's beating up on the Jews. The good, strong, brave Americans, led by FDR, beat the bad guys almost single-handedly, handing out candy bars and chewing gum along the way. Maybe with some help from Winston Churchill and Uncle Joe Stalin. Meanwhile, on the home front, everyone pitched in cooperatively in support of the war effort, sharing some inconveniences such as rationing, blackouts, scrap metal drives, some of which I remember. After the war, America built a new and more democratic, peaceful, and prosperous world order, restored Europe, governed Japan, and gave lots of foreign aid that the rest of the world should be grateful for. A lot of good Americans were killed in the process of doing the world a favor, particularly my father. And there were some victims of the world who the world didn't sufficiently recognize and compensate, particularly my mother and me. In this standard American view, World War II was the good war, won by the good Americans. My dad was a hero who helped save the world along with G.I. Joe, John Wayne, Douglas MacArthur, and Ike. Now, if World War II was all that important and all that was accomplished by such virtuous men, then we might feel at least some pride in our fathers and our country and some sense of compensation for our losses and the cost of the war. I suspect that a lot of other Americans had a similar view of World War II. And for the sake of arguments, let's assume that this straw man view was the standard view of World War II, held by the average American in the 1940s and perhaps into the 1950s. Academicians and military and political leaders who were in the know and who had been more involved or read more than I had, understandably and undoubtedly had a more informed view. But notice that this American view, this straw man view is a very American view. There may not even have been a standard view in Europe or in Asia where most of the war took place. And nothing quite like this American view. Survivors in Europe and Asia experienced the war directly in their homeland and were much more likely to have lost one or both parents, siblings, children, uncles and aunts, cousins, friends, homes, as whole villages and cities were wiped out and survivors were dispersed or disappeared as refugees or camp prisoners. It was even worse if one was a member of a persecuted minority. Many Europeans had to deal with the experience of defeat, occupation, collaboration, and/or resistance, of being cold, hungry, and fearful for several years. Well, how accurate or inaccurate was my simplified, idealized, standard strawman 1950s view of World War II? Tens of thousands of books have been written on the war since 1945. Some of them challenge or criticize this view. Well, first of all, I think it was right that it was a very big event. It wasn't confined to the US, Europe, and Soviet Union, and Japan. Nearly every country in the world was involved in World War II in some way. One Wikipedia website lists 102 countries that were involved, including little ones like Samoa or Liechtenstein. Most of these countries were associated with one or the other of two contending groups, one called the Axis, the other called the Allies, though about 24 countries remained neutral. Even the neutral countries such as Spain and Portugal and Ireland and Sweden and Switzerland tended to favor one side or the other, and some changed their leaning as the war progressed and the prospects of victory shifted from the Axis toward the Allies. The initial Axis countries were Germany and Italy, who made a treaty in 1936 that was known as the Rome-Berlin Axis. Japan joined in September 1940, about a year after the war actually got underway with Germany's invasion of Poland. Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, and Bulgaria joined the Axis in late 1940 or early 1941. They were either pressured or bribed by Germany to join and give it a path to the invasion of the Soviet Union, which they had planned for the summer of 1941. The initial Allied countries were Britain and France, but their declaration of war on Germany immediately brought in the Dominion countries and the colonies of the British Empire. The Soviet Union was initially allied with Germany in the attack on Poland, but joined the Allies in June of 41 when Germany switched and attacked it. The United States joined after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in December 41. Most Latin American countries supported the Allies more or less formally as the war progressed, starting with Panama and the other Caribbean countries in December of 41, and ending with Argentina and Chile in March and April of 1945. They remained neutral until the war was just almost over before they joined the Allied side. World War II was a big event in other ways, other than just the number of countries involved. The Encyclopedia Britannica describes it as a watershed event, marking a turning point in the world's course of events. This watershed led to, or accelerated, or shaped changes in geopolitics, in the role of government, in technology, in social patterns, in the arts, other areas. In geopolitics, first of all, World War II terminated the threat of Germany's Nazism, Italy's fascism, and Japan's militarism, or military imperialism, to become models for ruling the world. If those threats had succeeded, Western civilization and liberal democracy might well have been destroyed. World War II marked a shift of power away from Western Europe toward the USSR and the United States. It extended the USSR's power across the nations of Eastern and Central Europe and created the conditions for an extended Cold War in a bipolar world. World War II hastened the end of Western European colonialism in Africa and Asia, opening the doors to wars of national liberation, particularly in Vietnam. World War II enabled a communist government to seize power in mainland China, facing a rival non-communist government on the island of Taiwan. And World War II divided the Korean Peninsula, setting the stage for the Korean War. World War II hastened the creation of Israel by providing refugees, reparations, world sympathy, an event which impacted the Middle East down to today. World War II led to the creation of the United Nations and other organizations such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and institutions for international cooperation and for the peaceful resolution of disputes, sort of replacing the League of Nations attempt after World War I. With respect to the role of government in the United States and other countries, World War II solidified the increased presence and role of the federal government in the economic and political life of the country through public spending, taxation, regulation, redistribution, creation of a military-industrial complex, a security state. In the realm of technology, World War II accelerated changes in energy, particularly atomic energy and nuclear power. Electronics, particularly radar, television, computers. In medicine, particularly with drugs and technologies that help decrease mortality rates around the globe. In the sphere of society and culture, the U.S. saw several large changes. Very soon after the war, the military was desegregated racially, followed by much of the rest of society in short order. Women entered the labor force during the war. The population became increasingly mobile geographically. A pro-youth, short-term, self-centered culture was stimulated by parents who, having experienced the deprivation of the Great Depression in World War II, splurged on consumption and gave more power to their little darlings, the baby boomers. But World War II is not such a big event in people's minds as it was. I'm the bionic man. I hope those in the back row don't need to repeat what I've said so far. Today, the war doesn't dominate people's minds the way it once did. Much has happened since then. We've had a Cold War, a number of hot wars coming back. We've had the Korean War, the Vietnam, the two Iraq wars, 9/11, Afghanistan, civil rights movement, feminist movement, the rise in Asian countries to world prominence, a lot of prosperity, a lot of technological change and cultural change that make people think about other things when we've had the passing of generations. All these events and more have made the memory of World War II fade in clarity and shrink in relative importance. Fewer people know about Pearl Harbor Day, D-Day, VE Day, VJ Day. Observations of Memorial Day and Veterans Day have diminished. Oh, we have a defective unit.
All the
There
NSA.
There was a newspaper article about Mr. Jones being a defective in the police force, and then somebody called that to the attention of the paper, and they said, correction, he was a detective in the police force. Well, so World War II was a big event. It's less so today. And it didn't all start with Pearl Harbor. It had antecedents. The war did start with the attacks by Germany on Poland and Japan on Pearl Harbor. But historians have pushed the roots of World War II back a lot further. A textbook by Robert Palmer puts World War II in the context of the rise of power of the nation state since the Middle Ages. 20th century totalitarianism has carried this development of state sovereignty to an extreme, building up militaries, creating international crises, of which the last one led to war. Another historian, Philip Bobbitt, places World War II in the context of what he calls a long war, stretching from World War I to the Paris Peace Conference of 1990, which was the kind of a peace conference of the Cold War.
The long war was fought to determine what form the nation state would take that succeeded the dynastic states of the 18th century, whether the new form would be communism, fascism, or democracy. Niall Ferguson describes World War II as an effort to establish 3 centralized, race-based empires to rule the world: the Aryan race, the Roman race, and the Yamato race. All 3 of these are examples of the efforts to interpret World War II in terms of its place in some long-term trend that stretched way back before Poland or Pearl Harbor. Also preceding Pearl Harbor and Poland were various international issues or shocks. Perhaps the most commonly chosen starting point for a discussion of what caused or led up to World War II is the treaties which the victors imposed on the vanquished at the end of World War I. These treaties are often said to have been either too vindictive, or too punitive, or too lenient, or insufficiently enforced. In any case, they left major powers among the vanquished wanting to revise them by force if necessary. The Versailles Treaty was probably the most important of these post-World War I treaties, which imposed on Germany territorial concessions, military limitations, financial penalties, and acceptance of the League of Nations and a so-called war guilt clause requiring Germany to accept responsibility for causing all the loss and all the damage of World War I. There's something about this argument pertaining to the Treaty of Versailles. In 1990, a 93-year-old former Empress Eugenie of France, she was the wife of Napoleon III, said of the signed Treaty of Versailles, "I see in every article of this treaty a little egg, a nucleus of more wars." Or, in about the same year, 1919, Marshal Ferdinand Foch, who was commander-in-chief of the Allied army, said of the same treaty, "This is not a peace, it's an armistice for 20 years. He was very close. It was 20 years and 65 days before the next World War came. Now, although the actual severity of the Treaty of Versailles is now seen to have been less than the severity perceived at the time, some German politicians and other critics at the time created the popular impression that Germany was being crushed by onerous terms, and their propaganda was effectively used to discredit the Weimar Republic and to drum up support for the Nazis. For Italy and Japan, 2 other major powers disappointed in the Treaty of Versailles and who were on the Allied side in World War I, the treaty gave less war rewards of territory than they had wanted and expected. And the Treaty of Versailles also refused to give Japan one of the things that they most wanted, namely a statement of racial equality for all members of the League of Nations. These dissatisfactions with the Treaty of Versailles have been considered as important influences in pushing the German public, Japan and Italy, toward the Nazi side in the 1920s and 1930s. Another international factor, besides the post-World War I treaty, pushing each country's politics toward a totalitarian right in the 1930s, was the Great Depression. And to quote from a history text written by 2 professors whom I had in college, Professors Bike and Lafore, they said, "The most immediate and important cause for the sudden disintegration of the European situation after 1930 was the World Depression. This calamity wrecked the German Republic and brought Hitler to power. It paralyzed the governments of Britain and France and their allies. Every government was facing a domestic crisis which at least distracted its energies from foreign policy and at most threatened to destroy it by social revolution. Since every government resorted to nationalistic experiments and programs for solving the economic crisis, collaboration among them was made difficult and sometimes impossible. Now, within this context of broad historical themes or international shocks, there was a sequence of events within each individual country which also marked paths toward war. In Germany, the public was traumatized by an unexpected military surrender that got blamed on a stab in the back by Jews, communists, and socialists on the home front. They were traumatized by the threat of disruption from Bolshevik revolutionaries. They were traumatized by hyperinflation that wiped out much of private wealth and had discredited Weimar Republic. The German public was receptive to the message of a charismatic advocate of a single-party system that would disenfranchise the traitors, repudiate the humiliating treaty, and gain living space abroad needed for a resurgence of the fatherland. In the erroneous belief that they could control him, the existing leadership of Germany installed Hitler as chancellor in 1933, and within a year, he had consolidated a dictatorship. Germany withdrew from the League of Nations in 1933, began rearmament in 1935, remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936, annexed Austria and took the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia in 1938, and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia in early 1939. His next steps would be a treaty with the USSR and an attack on Poland. In Italy, Mussolini established himself at the head of a fascist dictatorship in the 1920s, then moved to revive a Roman Empire around the Mediterranean and North Africa. Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, supported Franco in the Spanish Civil War in 1936, withdrew from the League of Nations in 1937, and invaded Albania in 1939. For Japan, it, after World War I, resumed its policies of gaining control of foreign economic resources by forceful colonial expansion. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, withdrew from the League of Nations in 1933, escalated to a full Sino-Japanese war in 1937, moved into French Indochina in 1939, and joined the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy in 1940. Some of these paths to war also came from the democracies. The U.S. had a leading role in imposing the Treaty of Versailles that left so many countries wanting to revise it and repudiate it. The U.S. stayed out of the League of Nations that might have enforced or revised that treaty. The U.S. and other democracies largely disarmed after World War I, thereby losing the ability to deter rather than appease future aggressors in situations such as the Rhineland, Manchuria, Ethiopia, Austria, and the Sudetenland. The democracies resorted to trade restrictions in response to the Great Depression, which only made the problem worse. And the U.S. had also imposed trade restrictions on Japan in and after 1937 in response to its aggression in China. The upshot is that World War II had much deeper roots that reached back before Pearl Harbor and the invasion of Poland. Now we come to the part of my youthful view that said the good guys beat the bad guys. As any reader of the so-called comic books of the 1940s and 50s would know, the American GI was the good guy, and the Nazis, fascists, and militarists were the bad guys. No one needs to be convinced about the bad guys, but how good were the good guys? There's considerable documentation now about the U.S. military shooting of civilians and prisoners of war. about some unnecessary destruction of towns and villages, about the bombing of civilian areas in Europe. General Curtis LeMay, who was in charge of the bombing of Japan, and General Raymond Huft, who told his units crossing the Rhine not to take prisoners, both said that if the Axis had won the war, they would have been tried as war criminals. General LeMay also said, if you're going to use military force, then you ought to use overwhelming military force. Use too much, and deliberately use too much. You'll save lives, not only your own, but the enemy's too. The question of desertion is tricky. I've read that about 50,000 Americans and about 100,000 British soldiers deserted their armed forces, mostly in the European theater, because in the Pacific there was really no place to desert to. More than 21,000 Americans soldiers were convicted of desertion. 21,000. 49 of them were sentenced to death. Only one was actually executed. The U.S. desertion rate reached a peak of about 6% of the involved forces at the time of the Battle of the Bulge. And these desertions were almost always concentrated in the infantry and other frontline units. There was also some desertion to the black market, where soldiers stole U.S. supplies for sale to French citizens, or shacked up with French ladies. But desertion was reportedly much higher for the other combatant nations, particularly Germany and USSR, even though in both cases of Germany and USSR there were officers standing behind the lines with guns ready to shoot any deserter. Nonetheless, desertions were much greater than in the U.S. case. Interestingly, and what makes the issue a little bit tricky, is that desertion was not generally a matter of unwillingness to fight. Most deserters simply broke under the strain of battle, a very well-known psychological or psychiatric problem. Many of them had been fighting valiantly for long periods of time and had even earned medals for valor, then reached a point where they could no longer function in conditions of extreme stress. And the stress came from a variety of sources, including commanders who kept their men in the line for too long, despite guidelines. So the desertion figure of 100,000 total and 21,000 convicted, the interpretation of the reasons for that is somewhat more murky, in that the soldiers involved had just broken after prolonged combat. Moving on, controversy persists regarding the necessity or justification of dropping either or both atomic bombs on Japan, but I'm very persuaded by the literature that I've read that the alternatives to the atomic bomb, which were either invasion or starvation by blockade, would have produced far more deaths, both among the Japanese and the attacking allies, and that the core of the Japanese leadership was unwilling to surrender until it realized that the allies could destroy them without invading. The core Japanese leadership was counting on a Allied landing that would have such high casualties that the Allies would negotiate an end. So I think that controversy, at least for myself, is kind of settled. The bomb made the Allied landing unnecessary, and it made Japan's major strategy useless. There were also, within the United States, a significant anti-Semitism, up to and including the 30s and 40s. And attention has been drawn in various books to America's reluctance to help European Jews more, or to welcome them into the United States sooner than it did. And in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the U.S. had passed racially discriminating laws regarding immigration and land ownership, particularly by Asians. The U.S. had vetoed the racial equality clause sought by Japan in the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, and we had interned American citizens of Japanese descent, particularly in the western part of the country during World War II. The U.S., which was a racially segregated society, fought with a mostly segregated military and often treated badly much of the black segment of the armed forces. Perhaps some people on the home front did pitch in, but there were some profiteers, black marketeers. But the upshot of all these criticisms, as far as I can read, is however, quote, bad, unquote, the U.S. and its allies were in these respects, the Axis was far worse. The next point, did America win the war on its own? The preponderance of World War II's fighting and casualties occurred in Eastern Europe, Russia, and China. I'll show some figures in a moment. The historian Norman Davies wrote a book called Europe at War, No Simple Victory, said that World War II was really two wars. He said in Europe there was a war between two mass murderers, Russia and Germany, or the Soviet Union and Germany, one of whom the US and UK supported. In Asia, there was another war between Japan and China, with the US and the UK supporting China. Davis said that the war efforts of the Western powers were something of a sideshow. And I'll give some perspective of that with some numbers in just a moment. Did we win the war alone? No. The British won the crucial Battle of Britain, which kept Hitler from taking all of the European continent. Britain also supplied most of the Navy and nearly half of the engine fleet for D-Day, and was the dominant part of the Allied victories in the Middle East campaign, that was North Africa and Southwest Asia. The India campaign, and was an important part of the bombing campaign over Western Europe. Canada and the Commonwealth countries played important roles, as did units from other European countries. It was the USSR that beat the Germans at Moscow and at Stalingrad and at Kursk, and then pushed the Germans back into Poland by D-Day, and were closing in on Berlin in May of 1945. It is said that the number of deaths at the Battle of Stalingrad exceeded the total war deaths of the UK and the US, and I'll show that in a moment. And if you count the number of man months which the war lasted, that is, how many men serving how many months in what theater, the Eastern Front, which had about 406 million man months, compared to the Western Front of, no, I've got the wrong figure. The Western Front involved 406 million man months. No, 16 million. The Western Front involved 16.5 million man months. The Eastern Front, Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, had 406 million man months, 25 times the size of the Western Front. The U.S., for its part, did finance a lot of the weapons, the vehicles, and the supplies of the USSR, the UK, and China. For the USSR, I've read that this amounted to about 20% of its armored vehicles, The bulk of its troop transport trucks and jeeps and cargo planes, plus about 15 million pairs of boots. Some have said that World War I was won with American money and French and English blood, while World War II was won with American money and Russian blood. To give a numerical dimension to this, one website has the following numbers. Other websites give similar but not identical numbers. These matters of the estimates are not precise, but the pattern, I think, holds that the USSR experienced 26.6 million deaths, civilian plus military, which was 40% of the roughly 65 million total deaths of World War II estimated by this particular data source. The estimates of war deaths for World War II range anywhere from 60 to 80 million now, and this particular source has the figure 65 million, of which 40% were in the USSR. China, 15.8 billion deaths, or 24% of the total. And on Germany, 12% of the total. Poland, 9% of the total. Japan, 4% of the total. Great Britain and USA, about 0.6% of the total. Now, for all the drama and trauma that World War II represented for us in America, one way or another, to think of how small a percentage of the total world violence and loss that our experience represented, said something about the youthful perception I had of World War II.
What about Italy?
What about Italy? Gosh, I don't know. I think I'm going to say around 500,000, just something less than 1 million. I'm not certain that my memory is right on that, but if you go on the internet and Google or inquire for casualties in World War II, you'll get any number of websites that have pretty detailed figures.
Walter, do you have a percentage of the population who died, percentage of per capita of each of those countries?
I've seen such estimates on the web, and I don't remember them. I do remember the figure that one author, I think it was Niall Ferguson's, estimated about 3% of the world's population was killed by the total figure.
But a breakdown per country?
Breakdown per countries I can't recall, but they're on websites. They're amazingly easily accessible. Well, one of my other visions was that the U.S. set the world right with its creation of a new world order. However, the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, and all the rest of them did not prevent the Cold War, did not prevent wars of national liberation in Africa and Asia, or the Korean War, or other violent disputes down to today's Middle East, Africa, Eastern Europe, Asia, you name it. However, the nations of the world do still make use of the UN and those other institutions to conduct much of our world affairs, and we don't have a list of the wars that these things prevented. The U.S. did largely rebuild Germany, much of Western Europe, and Japan, which became some of the strongest members of the liberal democratic world. What is my conclusion? I should have said tentative conclusion. The view that World War II was a good war or necessary war in which the better guys beat the bad guys is still true, but is more nuanced and complicated than that 1950s standard that I put before you at the beginning. It was, in fact, the major event of the 20th century. It was started by the bad or worse guys, and it was won by the good, or at least the better guys. America did play a leading role in the victory and in setting up a new world order. People on the home front did pitch in. A lot of Americans did die in the effort, and perhaps some of the casualty victims were not adequately recognized. The test of whether the U.S. and its allies fought well and honorably in a good cause, for me, is to ask the following question: what would have happened if the Axis had won the war or had become victor by default had we not fought it? Germany, Italy, and Japan may have come close to winning at times, and what they represented is tyranny, racial hierarchy, slavery, and genocide. And that would have been the alternative to the costly and in some respects questionable war that we raised. That's my tentative conclusion. I'd be happy to hear any comments or questions from you.
Ed will take that side. Please
Couple of
raise
points.
your hand and speak into the mic.
Couple of points, if I may. You're,
I'm a little hard of hearing. Could you speak up?
okay, maybe.
Thank you.
The figures for the deaths in the various countries,
Yeah.
obviously those were related to civilian casualties, since that's where the wars were fought,
Yes.
particularly in Russia, where it's such a wide front going from Germany into Russia.
That's him.
And on this slide, a lot of Americans died in the effort. Yes, I think it was 400,000. Your dad, my dad. Some of the casualty victims weren't adequately recognized. And again, I think that goes to the civilian casualties, because I don't think anybody's keeping really close track of that,
The civilian casualties of the U.S. or
of all combatants.
there
It
is a
seems to
split.
imply that we don't know a lot of Americans that died in the effort. I think we do.
Right. Again, some of the website sources do split out the military from the civilian, and overall it's something like 60% of the total was civilian, and only 40% or less was military in that 65 million figure. And in those figures, I was just counting, I was just using the figures of reported deaths, not the figures of injury. And in every country that was involved in combat, there is injury. There is premature death of people who had physical or mental trauma in the war and died 3 or 4 years later that would not be included there. And there are several recent books out on the phenomenon of post-traumatic stress disorder, where a traumatized soldier makes life miserable for his family for decades to come. So the violence that resulted from the war is certainly much larger than the figures of death that I indicated. Again, you can get estimates of military versus civilian by country on the web, and overall, if I remember correctly, it's about 60% civilian, 40% military. And I think it was, in World War I, it was still the military deaths outnumbered the civilian deaths. And there was one observation made by a new book just out of World War II that said the Allies in World War II focused more on killing military opponents. The Axis focused more on killing civilian people, including exterminating the Jews. Yeah. Any other?
Next question. Okay, Grace, do you have the microphone? Yep. Thanks.
When you're talking about the American contribution to the war,
Yes.
I think it's probably somewhat larger than your focus on Europe allowed, because the United States basically fought the Pacific War on its own. There was a little bit of British maybe a tiny bit of French participation. Well, together, yeah, Australia, but the naval war was essentially fought by American ships and so on. Could you comment on that? And a second question is that one of the arguments about the role of the atom bomb in the surrender of Japan holds that the reason that the Japanese did surrender was that they were afraid of the Russians coming in. Roosevelt had actually, given them sanction, and they had already started invading Manchuria and Korea.
On the first question, I agree with you that I understated grossly the role of the U.S. in the Pacific War. I agree with you that the U.S. carried that largely on its own. I just didn't include that, and I stand corrected. On the second point about the Russian, the contribution of the Russian entry into the Japanese war, the book that I have relied on most recently is Richard Frank's Downfall, which looks at this question and the argument that I put forward. And he claims that the surrender decision by the Japanese was made before they knew the extent of the initial Russian victories when Russia came in, and that news of the Russian front, the Japanese Russian front was sort of scattered, and the upshot was that he argues that it was not that big a factor in their conscious decision. But he also emphasized that the 2 points that I made, that either trying to starve Japan into submission by blockade, which was also already partially in effect, would have involved larger numbers than the bomb did, and that of course invasion of itself would have involved larger numbers of both home front Japanese casualties and attacking. In addition to which, there were still large Japanese military forces stationed in China and around the Southwest Pacific, and you don't know exactly what they would have kept on killing had there been an invasion on the homeland of China. And that the Japanese thinking, as Richard Frank says, was that once they realized that the U.S. could win the war by dropping bombs rather than invading, the Japanese would lose the opportunity to inflict casualties that might influence the U.S. to negotiate a surrender. So on the second point, my impression is that the Russian factor was not all that important in the Japanese surrender. But I yield to Richard Frank's expertise on that. There was,
Question over here.
Sir,
Yeah.
where did you live at the time, and how were you and your mom informed about your dad's passing?
could you ask that again, please?
Where did you live at the time, and how were you informed, you and your mom, how were you informed about your dad's passing in the war?
How was I informed by my dad's passing? I don't have clear memories of it. I recently came into possession of the telegram that arrived announcing it. What I sort of remember, and it may be just be influenced by family lore, is that my mother's family, her generation, heard the news, came to our house, and to help her, and sent me out with a cousin to take a walk. And I had no real comprehension of what's going on. Otherwise, my memory is kind of vague about the detail of that.
Okay, where did you live?
Beg your pardon?
Where did you live?
I lived in Huntington, West Virginia, which was my parents' hometown as well.
How old were you?
I was 2 when my father left and 4 when he was killed. A couple of copies of my book are over here on the table if you'd like to look at them. They're all secondhand because it's out of print. And I get them off of eBay now, so they go cheaply if you want to buy them. You can buy them for 10 cents plus postage on them. There was one guy who wanted me to autograph his copy of my book, and he said, I got it for 35 cents on the web. So I initialed it.
I want to thank you very, very much for sharing all this research you've done. Appreciate it. I'd like to add a few things, if I might.
Yes.
In previous wars, infection and sanitation and the flu and that sort of thing was a tremendous factor. I can remember that I was born in 1919, and flu had ravaged the country, and it ravaged the world. And when I read up on it later, more people died all over the world after World War I from the flu than died in the war. And,
War, pestilence, and famine.
yep, and how impressed I am that the world keeps changing so fast. There's no way in the world we can look at the future that's going to happen. What can we really learn from the past? We try our best.
Okay, next question there.
May I ask,
It's not
although not the main focus of your talk, do you know what time your father came ashore on D-Day?
About 11:30 or 11:30 in the morning. But he asked what time my father came on shore.
Came ashore.
The initial assault was about between 6 and 7 o'clock in the morning.
Right,
It
the
was by
29th.
the 116th Regiment of the 29th Division. My father was in the 15th Regiment of the 29th, and their role was to be held a little bit in reserve to see how the first landing went.
And can you speak
if the
to that?
landing had gone well, they would have come in late afternoon, but the
Right.
landing, the
Didn't
first
go.
wave ran into so much resistance and casualties that they then sent in early, were the 2nd Regiment, both the 29th and the 1st Divisions. So about 11:30 in the morning, at which time the action right on the beach had decreased considerably.
Right.
So most of the fire that he was exposed to was from mortars at some distance, plus occasional snipers, plus mines. But he didn't encounter the initial machine gun fire of the first wave.
I was going to say, do you want to amplify on that point? Because I'm not sure a lot of people know, or everybody knows about the Bedford Boys and, all of that.
He's asking me to talk about the Bedford Boys, which was Bedford was a town in Virginia from which a lot of young guys volunteered together and trained together from the local Bedford National Guard. They were in the 116th Regiment of the 29th Division.
The first
And,
wave.
Well, yeah, this terminology of wave is a little confusing, but they were among the first to land. And I forget the exact numbers, but I'd say 90% of this Bedford unit was killed on first landing. And that forms the story of a book entitled The Bedford Boys.
Okay.
Actually, I've been told that there was it was said that was the highest casualty of any town's unit experienced, and another veteran said, no, my town was in Pennsylvania, Clearfield, Pennsylvania, had a higher per capita
Really?
loss on the first day. So it's almost like along the French coast, you'll find any number of towns saying we were the first liberated. Yes.
This is not a question directly for you, but rather for a number of veterans here. My father was a doctor and enlisted right after Pearl Harbor. He spent 3 years He shipped out within, I think, a couple of weeks. There was no training or anything like that. He went first to England and then immediately to North Africa, Sicily, and then Italy. And he didn't come back until the spring of '45. I think it was the summer, early summer. But my question is, he never talked with us about the war at all. I was, I think, 12 or 13 when he came back, so I was of a certain age. Did anyone else have a father who came back, and did you hear anything about what happened?
Anybody else want to speak to that? Yes?
My father never spoke about it, and his young kids. My father never spoke about it, and his young kids. My father always said we were on the American team and did what we had to do. He had a great respect, though, for those who did more than he did.
I think it's quite common that people who were involved in combat were sufficiently traumatized that to talk about their experience was to bring back that trauma, which was a very painful experience. In addition to which, they felt unable to convey to the listener who didn't have that experience how horrible it was. And if they couldn't convey it, the listener couldn't fully appreciate it. And if the listener didn't fully appreciate it, that devalued the participants' experience.
We have one more here. Carol?
I'm very familiar with that. Yes.
I was speaking more or less to what you were as a child reacting to this. I was probably in primary school at that time. I was born in Wayland, Massachusetts, and my family moved when I was quite young because my father was going to work at radiation lab at MIT developing radar. And so we moved to Lexington because of the commute and the gas rationing and all of that. But what I remember was I lived on Muzzy Street in Lexington, right in the center of town. What I remember on a day in which I'm playing out in my front porch and in the yard, of this very formal man walking down the street. The only other man who walked down the street was Mr. Whalen, who lived at the end of the street, walked dressed in suit and tie and whatnot to go take the bus, to go take the train to go to work in Boston. But this man was walking down, and he was clearly very official, and I didn't know him. And so I was curious, and he went into the house next door. He went to the house next door and rang the bell, and that was Mrs. Mara, and Mrs. Mara had one son in the war, serving in the war at the time. And she opened the door, and the wail that came out of that woman's mouth was just, I remember it to this day. And I couldn't wait for my mother to come home. And when she came home, and I said, "You must go to Mrs. Mara, something terrible has happened. This very dressed man came down the street." And I sort of had a feeling for what had happened, but I didn't know that. And it was, he was telling her that she lost her son.
Thank you. Again, in comment to your question, one other thing I noticed is when the movie Saving Private Ryan came out with its very graphic description or portrayal of the D-Day landing, that enabled a lot of veterans who had been unable to speak about it prior to it to open up and say that was what it was like. So they had something to refer to. And I saw a number of instances of that. I also saw, as I began attending meetings of the 29th Division Association, that at those meetings, the combat veterans could talk among themselves, but not among the non-veteran public. Any question?
Yes, can you hear me? Right? Well, I want to mention that I was very interested. Yeah, I was. I went on vacation out to Wyoming, and I just by chance found out that there was a Japanese concentration camp or internment camp there preserved. And I'd like to know your thoughts on the mindset during that period where the Japanese were interred and you know, they were put into these camps and assembly locations and then sent out to these camps that were as far east as Arkansas, I believe, and over in Wyoming and so forth. And it was frankly, a racist policy. because those of German and Italian descent, I don't believe, maybe there were some of them, but that was not done to them. And I'd just like to know your thought about the mindset at that time and how we look at it now, decades later.
I'm not an expert on the mindset at the time. I was 4 years old and lived in West Virginia. From what I've read, you're right that it was partially a racist reaction, but not entirely. There was a hysteria about being bombed and losing 2,000 American servicemen at Pearl Harbor. So I would say it was probably a mixed motive at that time, but certainly tilted toward racism. And it's also true that I think, from what I've read, that the racist propaganda that we developed against the Japanese, against the Asians, was much more caricatured and coated with evil than the corresponding propaganda against the Germans. The prejudice against the Asians has a longer history than that, though, because in the immigration laws of the 1890s and 1924, the Asians were sort of picked out, Chinese and Japanese, picked out for limitation on entry and property ownership. So there was a xenophobia, a racialism, all of which is not politically correct today. So our attitudes have changed from something more severe back then to something less severe now. Yeah. But I don't remember that part of the war experience.
I'd like to follow up. I'd like to follow up on that same situation because I grew up in Lexington during the war, and we had German submarines off the coast on this side. As a matter of fact, I had the opportunity to ride with the Civil Air Patrol looking for submarines off our coast. And
Gremlins.
running out of juice. But my cousin lived.
Sorry about that.
Speak up. Talk loud. Just speak loudly.
I can't record it. So the guy in the booth, my cousin lived in California, and the same thing was going on in California. And they were seriously concerned about an attack on the West Coast. And so my aunt sent my cousin to New England for the first 2 years of the war so that he wouldn't be hurt from a bombing attack or a ground attack in Southern California. So part of the situation with the Japanese population was a prejudice, and I can go into some of that actually was occurring in Lexington. But I can tell you that the primary reason was a real concern about an attack and about that population assisting in whatever attack would take place. So it had its basis in a concern for the health and welfare. And if you were in Lexington and had all your, I went around in people's houses and made all their blinds secure so that you could have your lights on. We had air raids. I could go on for half an hour, but I'll save you that. Thanks.
I wanted to add a little addition simply because of the Japanese prisoner of war camp. When my father came back, he was allowed 2 weeks, and then he was sent to the camp in Wisconsin, Camp McCoy, which was a Japanese prisoner of war camp, and he was the doctor for that. And we saw from time to time, we didn't go very often to the camp, we children, but we did see rows of Japanese chained together and being marched down. It was a curious thing for kids to find out about.
What was your reaction to seeing?
Pardon?
What was your reaction to seeing chained prisoners?
I think,
detainees?
I don't know that I had any overt reaction. I can still see the picture.
Yeah.
I just want to relate a story. Actually, my uncle, much older than I, has since passed away. He was also a physician, landed at Normandy. I'm not sure which beach, but on the second day, and with a certain amount of ambivalence, and I think really guilt, in the sense that he told that he wasn't sure whether or not his life was saved, because coming over from England on the ship, he became seasick. And at the time that the rest of his unit landed, he was vomiting, he was in no shape to go up to join the rest of the unit. He eventually, I'm not sure whether or not he wouldn't talk about it or he didn't talk about the further experiences after his landing at Normandy, but he did relate, and as I say, I suspect that there was a tremendous amount of survivor's guilt in his talking about. He would laugh, he joked about, but he did say that he felt he probably survived because he became seasick and he couldn't advance with his unit as a physician.
We're running out of time. We're going to do 2 or 3 more comments, okay?
This will be very brief, but my husband's uncle was in the Stonewall Brigade, which is the 29th, and landed with your father.
It's the
16th
regiment of the 29th Division.
Okay, good. Whatever that is. Anyway, he came ashore with your father because he came ashore that first day, and he survived.
Good.
We're glad.
Yes.
A couple more? Just one second, because you've already spoken, just in case anyone who has not made a comment yet. If not, we'll go around a second round.
Question over here. Your hands are posted.
So we'll you, Bill, and Warren, and then after this.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. The viewpoint you described in the 50s is certainly what I experienced as a teenager. If you were to address teenagers today, how would they feel about World War II? Is it different?
Do teenagers today feel different? I don't think they're told about it. For more than 12 years, I helped lead a history study tour of the Allied landing area, and the students that we took were
Speak into the
16
mic,
to-
please. Speak into the mic.
Gee, it's awfully loud in my ears. I helped lead for more than 12 years a history study tour of the Normandy landing area, a 12-day trip of the beaches. The group were primarily 16 to 19-year-old, and they were immensely interested. They took it extremely seriously. Well, extremely is the wrong word, but very seriously. So I saw the phenomena of teenagers having a great appreciation for the history, and my question is whether all teenagers are just not given the exposure to this history in their curriculums in the school. I don't know. So I guess it's mixed. I remember the first time I went back to Normandy with our children, and they couldn't care less about what was going on. They were 13 to 15 years old or something like that. The second time I went back, they couldn't get enough of it, and they were 18 to 20 or something like that. So I'm not giving you a very helpful answer, except that I think it's just not stressed enough in the presentation of history in the curriculum.
My sense is they're generally clueless, and most still, if they do know, they still think the war started in 1941.
Yeah.
Okay, next to last question.
Just a comment about the Japanese internment. First of all, you talk about hysteria, let's make it a smaller word and say fear. Plus, I think there was an entire perception that the Japanese were very insular, very family-oriented, very connected to their roots in the home country, and perhaps not this whole infrastructure of Japan in the United States was not well understood, and therefore we were more fearful than we would have been, and perhaps more fearful than we were of the Germans and Italians. So I think that had a lot to do with it. We just didn't know what they would do, how they would react, and that tied into the fear of being vulnerable on the West Coast.
All right. Let's move on and on. Lloyd, make it quick.
Yes, there's a book about the internment of the Japanese. It's called The Train to Crystal City. It's Crystal City is an internment camp in southern Texas. And the reason I bring this up is my father worked with the first generation Japanese. They worked together, and he talked about this, and it was very deeply disturbing to him. And eventually he committed suicide. And in this book, there was another Japanese, first generation Japanese American, that committed suicide. So it was something that was very difficult for these people to deal with throughout their lives.
Yeah, just a little bit. I was already on active duty since September 1941. When Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and we ended up rounding up Japanese people up and down the coast and put them in internment camps. You have to remember that, in a way, and something you've never heard anybody say, we were protecting them from people in the United States that wanted to kill Japanese. We saved a lot of lives doing it. We'll never know how many. Think about it.
Well, we not only want to thank Walter for his wonderful presentation, but for the thought-provoking conversation that was generated. Thank you so much, Walter.